This happened to me back when I was working as a lighthouse keeper on the East Coast. It's been years, but I still remember every detail, like it was burned into me. I didn't talk about it for a long time. People don't believe stories like this, especially when you don't even fully understand them yourself. But I'll try to tell it as clearly as I can. The storm rolled in faster than anyone expected. The forecast had called for rough seas and heavy rain, nothing too unusual for the season. I'd been stationed at the lighthouse for about 3 months at that point, doing the usual, maintaining the light, logging ship movements, checking weather reports, and waiting for supply runs every 2 weeks. It was lonely, sure, but I'd gotten used to the routine. That night, though, everything unraveled. The wind started around sunset, howling low and steady, rattling the glass panes in their frames. By the time it was fully dark, the rain came, sheets of it, hammering against the walls so loud it felt like the entire tower was under siege. The ocean below was a mass of black water, waves slamming into the rocks with a force that made the entire structure tremble. I radioed in, like protocol demanded. Static. Nothing but a hiss on every channel. The Coast Guard sometimes cut in and out during heavy weather, so I wasn't panicked yet. I figured I'd ride it out until morning. The first sign things weren't normal came when the main power flickered and died. One moment the beacon was sweeping its arc across the Black Sea, the next it was swallowed in darkness. I switched over to the backup generator, which kicked on with a groan, buzzing and humming the way old machines do when they've been asked for too much. I told myself it would hold. It didn't. Not even an hour later, the generator coughed twice and went silent. I went down to check it, fumbling with my flashlight, but the basement floor was already wet, water seeping in through the cracks, pooling across the stone. The storm surge was higher than normal, the tide shoving water straight into the foundation. When you're alone in a lighthouse during a storm, silence is your enemy. You need the hum of the generator, the sweep of the light, the crackle of the radio, little things that remind you the world is still turning. But with everything dead, the silence grew heavier than the storm itself. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind screaming against the glass, but it wasn't. It was sharper, human, a voice. Help! Clear as day, shouting from outside. I froze. There was no way. Nobody could be out there. No fisherman would be this close to shore in a storm like this. And even if someone had gone overboard, the waves would have torn them apart long before they reached the rocks. But then I heard it again, louder. Help me! I grabbed my flashlight, climbed up to the lantern room, and aimed the beam through the sheets of rain. Nothing. Just water thrashing against black stone, spray exploding high enough to coat the windows. The voice came again, closer this time, like it was right at the base of the tower. Please, help! I wanted to believe it. Every instinct as a keeper screamed at me to respond. After all, saving lives was part of the job. But reason told me it wasn't possible. The rocks below were nothing but jagged teeth, invisible under the waves. No one could stand there and call up without being torn apart. The storm raged on. I tried to ignore it, tried to sit at my desk with the logbook open, but the words blurred. The voice kept coming. Sometimes it was a man's voice, sometimes a woman's. Sometimes it sounded like multiple people calling together, rising above the storm for a split second before fading again. Hours passed like that. My flashlight beam cut through nothing but rain and spray. The water in the basement rose higher, forcing me to seal off the hatch. I knew I was in real danger, but the voices made it impossible to think straight. By midnight, I was a wreck. My hand shook as I flipped through the emergency manual, though I already knew it by heart. The only thing left to do was wait. For the storm to break, for the supply boat, for anything. And then, around 2 a.m., something changed. The voices stopped. Instead, there was a single, heavy knock at the metal door at the base of the lighthouse. It echoed up the spiral staircase, sharp and deliberate. I froze at the desk, my breath caught in my throat. Another knock followed, slower, louder, like someone was striking the door with the flat of their hand. Nobody could be down there. The entrance was half submerged, but the knocking kept coming, steady as a heartbeat. I didn't go down. I couldn't. I sat in the dark, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, listening to the door rattle in its frame as the unseen visitor pounded against it. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence after was worse than the knocking. When morning finally came, the storm eased. Weak sunlight broke through the clouds, and the sea calmed enough for the supply boat to approach. I was pale, exhausted, barely able to stand when the crew found me. They pumped the water from the basement and checked the structure. Everything was intact, no sign of damage. But when we went down to inspect the door, we found something none of us could explain. 5 long streaks, deep gouges, dragged across the steel, like something with claws had raked at it all night. I never went back after that rotation. I requested reassignment inland, and I never set foot in a lighthouse again. But I still dream about it. The storm, the voices, the knock. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear it, echoing through the dark, asking to be let inside.
The lighthouse stood on a barren spit of rock, a jagged finger stretching into the Atlantic. 2 men had been stationed there for months. Richard Hale, a 38-year-old veteran keeper with a strict adherence to routine, and Thomas Gray, a younger man in his late 20s who had volunteered for the post out of desperation for work. Isolation gnawed at both men, though in different ways. Richard handled it by clinging to order, meals at the same time every day, log entries neat and precise, lamp cleaning with almost religious devotion. Thomas, however, grew restless. He smoked too much, paced the narrow circular halls, and often muttered about the supply boat being late, even when it wasn't. Weeks turned into months and the storm season rolled in. The waves battered the rocks without mercy. The radio crackled on and off, sometimes silent for days. Richard tried to keep the logs filled, barometer falling, winds increasing, Gray restless again. But the cracks were beginning to show. One night, during a particularly violent storm, the power went out. The backup generator groaned once, then went still. The lantern at the top had to be kept lit manually, and Richard and Thomas worked by lamplight. The whole tower trembled with every gust. That was when the fight began. No one knew exactly what started it. Maybe it was a careless remark, or the way Thomas slammed a door, or how Richard snapped at him for letting the flame gutter too low. But according to the survivor's later report, Thomas grew violent, shouting that Richard was trying to keep him here, and that they didn't want him to leave. In the blackout, shadows turned the cramped space into something smaller, suffocating. The storm howled like a living thing outside, rain hammering against the thick glass. The 2 men struggled. There was shouting, the sound of something heavy falling, then silence. When dawn came, only Richard remained. He reported in the logs that Thomas had vanished into the storm. But the logs themselves told another story. Earlier entries written in Richard's meticulous hand had grown erratic in the days leading up to the fight. Notes about Thomas watching me too closely, pacing at night, whispering to himself. Later entries were worse. I hear him even when he's not there. Voices in the stairwell. Storm won't stop. Neither will he. When the relief boat finally arrived weeks later, Richard was the only one to greet them. Pale, gaunt, eyes sunken with sleeplessness, he told them Thomas had simply gone outside during the storm and never returned. The rocks and waves had claimed him. But the supply crew found no signs of Thomas. No coat missing, no boots gone, no prints in the mud outside. What they did find was a blood stain in the narrow corridor near the generator room. It had seeped between the stones, half scrubbed but still visible. When confronted, Richard only shook his head and repeated, "The storm took him. That's what I wrote." The logs were taken back to the mainland for review. Experts couldn't agree. Some said Richard had clearly broken under the pressure of isolation, that paranoia had consumed him and he had done something unspeakable to his crewmate. Others claimed the strange, disjointed entries suggested both men had been slipping, that something about the storm, the endless roar of the sea, and the isolation of the rock itself had driven them toward madness. The official report listed Thomas Gray as lost at sea. Richard Hale was relieved of duty and sent inland, never to work a lighthouse again. But among keepers, the story still circulates. Some say Richard murdered Thomas in a fit of rage and tried to cover it up. Others whisper that Thomas really did disappear, not into the storm, but into the lighthouse itself, swallowed by the shadows that seemed to move in step with the crashing waves.
The sea has a way of playing tricks on the mind. You spend enough nights alone with nothing but the crash of the waves and the endless horizon, and you start to see things. Or at least that's what they tell you. That's what they told me. But I know what I saw. It was the winter of 1987, and I was stationed at Blackthorn Point Lighthouse, about 12 miles from the nearest harbor. It was one of the last manned stations in the region before they automated most of the lights. The place was old, built in the late 1800s, and it showed. The iron stairs groaned with every step, and the lantern room leaked whenever the wind drove rain sideways. But it was home, at least for that season. My supply boat came once every 3 weeks, weather permitting. Other than that, it was me, the logs, and the light. Nights were long, days even longer. My only connection to the outside world was the radio. Checked in every morning at 0600 and again before lights out. It had been storming for 3 days straight when it happened. One of those black squalls that swallowed the horizon, where the sky and sea blended into a single heaving mass of gray. Waves slammed the rocks hard enough to shake the tower, and the wind howled through cracks in the window frames. I was up in the lantern room, trimming the wick and polishing the glass, when I spotted it. Through the sheets of rain, maybe a mile out, a fishing boat was struggling against the waves. I could just make out its shape, a trawler-sized vessel riding low in the water, bow pitching dangerously. At first, I thought it was just passing through, someone trying to make it back to port before the storm got worse. But then I saw the flare. A burst of red light cut across the gray sea, swallowed almost instantly by the storm. Distress. No mistaking it. I dropped the cloth, grabbed the binoculars, and leaned hard against the glass. Even through the rain, I could see figures on deck. At least 2, maybe 3. Clinging to the rail. One waved an arm wildly, signaling. The boat was in trouble.
I scrambled down the stairs, nearly slipping, and radioed the Coast Guard. Blackthorn Point to Sector 4, over. I've got a vessel in distress, 1 mile east-southeast, flare sighted. Repeat, vessel in distress, over. Static crackled, then the operator's voice cut through. Copy, Blackthorn. Confirm position of sighting. I gave the coordinates, heart pounding. I could still see it from the lower windows, the trawler lurching hard, nearly broadsiding a wave. We're dispatching a cutter from Harbor Station. ETA 25 minutes. Keep visual contact. Over. I confirmed and signed off, then went back up to the lantern room. My hands shook as I pressed the binoculars to my face. The boat was still there, struggling, listing heavily to one side now. I watched, helpless, as wave after wave battered it. The men on deck looked smaller by the second, their shapes blurred by sheets of rain and sea spray. Then, in a lull between waves, I blinked. The boat was gone. I lowered the binoculars, rubbed my eyes, then raised them again. Nothing but water. Endless, storm-churned water. I scanned the horizon frantically. Left, right, closer to shore, farther out. Nothing. I thought maybe it had gone under, capsized too quickly for me to catch. I grabbed the radio. Sector 4, Blackthorn Point. Vessel has gone down. Repeat, vessel has gone down. I cannot see wreckage. Over. There was a pause on the other end. Then, copy, Blackthorn. Cutter is en route. Maintain visual search. Over. I confirmed and signed off. Then went back up to the lantern room. My hands shook as I pressed the binoculars to my face. The boat was still there, struggling, listing heavily to one side now. I watched, helpless, as wave after wave battered it. The men on deck looked smaller by the second, their shapes blurred by sheets of rain and sea spray. Then, in a lull between waves, I blinked. The boat was gone. I lowered the binoculars, rubbed my eyes, then raised them again. Nothing but water. Endless storm-churned water. I scanned the horizon frantically. Left, right, closer to shore, farther out. Nothing. I thought maybe it had gone under, capsized too quickly for me to catch. I grabbed the radio. Sector 4, Blackthorn Point. Vessel has gone down. Repeat, vessel has gone down. I cannot see wreckage. Over. There was a pause on the other end. Then, copy, Blackthorn. Cutter is en route. Maintain visual search. Over. So, I did. For the next hour, I searched every corner of that storm-lashed sea. I expected debris, oil slick, lifeboats, something. But there was nothing. Not a board, not a rope, not even a life ring. Just water. When the cutter finally arrived, lights sweeping the waves, I felt a surge of relief. They circled for over an hour, combing the area. I guided them by radio, pointing them to where I'd seen the flare, where the boat had last been. But they found nothing. At dawn, the storm broke. The sea calmed. The cutter returned to harbor, empty-handed. I logged the event in the station journal as required. 0215 hours. Sighted vessel in distress. Flare launched. Contacted Coast Guard. Vessel disappeared. No wreckage found. The next morning, I got a call from the station chief. "You sure about what you saw?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said, forcing the steadiness into my voice. "Fishing trawler, flare, 3 men on deck, maybe more." There was a pause. Then he sighed. "Son, there were no vessels reported in your sector last night. No distress calls logged, nothing on radar. Are you sure you weren't seeing things? Storm like that can make the waves look like boats." I wanted to argue, but what could I say? That I saw their faces, that I watched them wave for help. My hands tightened around the receiver. "I know what I saw," I said quietly. He didn't argue, just told me to get some rest. But rest never came. That night, when the sea was calmer, I thought I saw it again, far out, just for a moment. The same trawler, riding low, lights flickering. When I blinked, it was gone. Over the following weeks, I swore I saw it more than once, always at night, always in storms. A shape in the rain, a flicker of light where there shouldn't be one. Sometimes I thought I heard it too, the faint, distant blast of a foghorn carried on the wind. I stopped mentioning it on the radio. I didn't want to sound crazy, but every sighting I logged privately, in the back of the journal where only I would know. And then one night, I heard something worse. The radio crackled to life at 3 a.m., long after check-in. A faint voice, barely audible through static. "Mayday! Mayday!" It was weak, broken, swallowed by interference. I sat frozen, the hairs on my arms standing up. "Vessel in distress, state your position," I answered. Nothing. Just static. "Repeat, this is Blackthorn Point. Vessel in distress, state your position." The static hissed, then cut out entirely. The radio stayed silent the rest of the night. When I checked with the Coast Guard the next morning, they confirmed no distress calls logged, no vessels missing. That was my last season at Blackthorn. They automated the light the following year. I still think about it sometimes. That boat out in the storm, the figures on deck, waving, the flare, bright against the dark. People tell me the sea plays tricks, that isolation gets to you, that I imagined it all. But here's the thing. When the station was decommissioned, I managed to get a copy of the old logbooks, and in 1954, 33 years before my posting, another keeper logged this entry. 0210 hours. Vessel sighted east-southeast in storm. Flare launched, contacted Coast Guard, vessel disappeared, no wreckage recovered. The coordinates he listed? They were the exact same as mine.